On this sunny but cold day, and so we're finishing off our series, as Ian said. So a big welcome to you all, whether you're on site with us, delighted to see old familiar faces or young familiar faces as well, and lots of new people as well, which is great, and also great to connect with those people online as I've been tracking with this series called Deeper Connections. And in particular today, we're thinking about forgiveness. And just the impact that can have on our relationship with God and with each other. Right throughout this series, we've been looking at sort of trying to reconnect, because COVID's robbed us of so much of that sense of connection, that ability to get together one with another because of restrictions and lockdowns, and some of that has even impacted our relationship with God. So for the last few weeks, we've looked at different things like confession and celebration and worship and God's guidance in order to help us to connect. And so this morning, we're thinking about forgiveness. Forgiveness, that deliberate, that intentional release of people when they've hurt us. Wow, what a powerful tool that is when someone's hurt us and you just think, I just want to get my own back. I want to get revenge on them. And somehow we make that choice to say, do you know what? I'm going to release you. I'm not going to be negative. I'm not going to be vengeful. I'm not going to get my own back. This is the beautiful concept that we're going to look at this morning and its potential impact. And right off, I have to ask for forgiveness. I've got to be honest, I abused my position yesterday as your church leader. We've already heard about the wonderful women's brunch that took place here. And I'll confess, I was sat nearby and just sat at home, a little bit of football maybe on the television, and my wife, Kerry, comes home, and she starts talking about the food. She talks about the croissants, filled with bacon and cheese and wonderful things, and my stomach started to rumble a little bit as I sat there watching the football. I said, do you think there's any food left, babe? And she goes, oh yeah, there is some left. And of course, I couldn't come across and get it because it was a women's brunch. So I said to Kerry, any chance of going next door and bringing some back? So I had 3 wonderful bacon croissants, care of the women's brunch. So please forgive me, I have sinned. Okay, but thank you for such a wonderful time yesterday. The blessing didn't just stay with the women. I received some blessing as well. But you know, this idea of forgiveness, that release of people is so powerful. And that's what we want to explore this morning. And the way we're going to do it is turn to the third book of the second part of the Bible, the Gospel of Luke. And in this account, this is where this man, this doctor, looks at the life and times and ministry of Jesus and writes it in a way to encourage people to go on an exploration to find God. He writes to people who are friends with God, people who want to be friends with God. And he said, I'm inviting you to come and do a bit of digging with me. Because there's so much truth about Jesus. We just seem to scratch the surface about Jesus of Nazareth. And there's this encouragement to dig deeper, discover truth that can be life-changing. And that's the presentation that Luke does in his account of the life and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. And he invites us. He says, look, if you're a friend of God, if you want to be a friend of God, come with me and do some digging. So if that is you today, you're in the right place, because we're going to get some spades out and do a bit of digging today. And we're going to jump in at Luke 19. In the previous chapter, Jesus had been teaching about who is acceptable within the kingdom of God. And he's causing a bit of a stir, because somehow he's a bit critical of people who are religious, people who do this kind of stuff, going to church. Those people who said, oh yeah, I'm a child of God. And in doing this, he then starts to offer hope for people who are outside of church, outside of synagogue, outside of the religious system, and said, you know what? These people are part of what God wants. These people are part of the family of God. And he starts to teach this, and as he's on this journey from the northern part of Galilee on the way to Jerusalem for Passover and ultimately to his crucifixion, in Jerusalem, he starts to meet people and he starts to live out this teaching. And we're going to see one of these encounters as we look at Luke chapter 19. If you have got your Bibles, do follow along. If not, we'll have most of the reading up there on the PowerPoint slides as well. And what I wanted to do today is kind of embrace a little bit of Eastern Jewish style of teaching. Normally, I tend to be quite Greek in our approach, which is typical of our education system here in our country, i.e. everything's very sequential, everything follows through. But actually, Jewish and Eastern teaching likes to walk around a little bit, likes to have a little wander around, then start to dig deeper. And that's the approach what we're going to take today as we want to find some treasure in this wonderful encounter when Jesus meets this chap called Zacchaeus. Okay, let's get stuck in then and start reading from Luke 19, verse 1. Jesus entered Jericho and made his way through the town. There was a man there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector in the region, and he had become very rich. He tried to get a look at Jesus, but he was too short to see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree beside the road, for Jesus was going to pass that way. When Jesus came by, he looked up and saw Zacchaeus and called him by name. Zacchaeus, he said, quick, come down. I must be a guest in your home today. Zacchaeus quickly climbed down and took Jesus to his house in great excitement and joy. But the people, they were displeased. He's gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner, they grumbled. Meanwhile, Zacchaeus stood before the Lord and said, I will give half my wealth to the poor, Lord. If I have cheated people on their taxes, I will give them back 4 times as much. Jesus responded, salvation has come to this home today, for this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save those who are lost. So that's the account we're going to look at today. And as I say, rather than necessarily going it through sequentially, verse by verse, what we're going to do is start from the outsides and dig in towards this treasure. So on this journey, we're going to see us digging away about the way in and the way on of Jesus around Jericho. We're going to see the wealth that comes in and the wealth that goes out, care of Zacchaeus. We're going to see a war that goes on between the crowd and their reaction to Jesus. And then we're going to see the way up the tree, the way down the tree, and finally the nugget, the gem, the treasure is the impact of the wonderful love of Jesus. So that's where we're going to go this morning. Hopefully you can stick with me as we kind of attack this encounter from 2 sides in a way, with our shovels digging away to get deeper into this treasure. So first of all then, let's look at the outsides, the verse 1 and verse 10 of this. It says in verse 1, Jesus entered Jericho and made his way through the town. Jericho, if you've ever read your Bibles, you've noticed that, and back in the Old Testament, it's actually one of the oldest cities in the world. I think it's been rebuilt about 20 times, archaeologists tell us. And it was because it was a gateway. You had the River Jordan. It was a gateway onto Jerusalem and onto the Promised Land. So the Romans loved Jericho. It became a tax place where they could tax and use it as a customs town. And Jesus is going there, but he's not staying there. Jesus is going to pass through this key town. And I think that was a source of disappointment for the people of Jericho. Jesus, this brilliant, young, dynamic rabbi, everybody's talking about him. He's on his way to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem. He's coming through our town as in good old Jewish Eastern hospitality stakes there, thinking, great, he's going to come and stay with us. And actually he said, no, I'm just passing through. So feel the sense of disappointment. And yet, at the end of this little encounter, we discover there is a transformation taking place in this town. As we read in verses 9 and 10, Jesus responds at the end of his encounter with Zacchaeus, salvation has come to this home today, for this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save those who have lost. Jesus seemed to be passing through, yet he decides to take a diversion of his agenda to bring salvation and rescue to a particular person in a particular house in Jericho. Jesus used this term, salvation has come. In the way, the original Greek, the idea is, at great cost, I have brought salvation and rescue to this man. And we'll unpack that cost a little bit more. He now describes Zacchaeus, a guy who we're going to see was not a nice guy, suddenly is described as a true son of Abraham. In other words, this is a guy who's taken a chance on God. This is a guy who doesn't know what the future holds, but he says, you know what, I'm going to trust God on the story here. And he runs with him. And we see this expression, the agenda of Jesus, the Son of Man came to seek and to save. This is a shock for the culture of the day, because they thought the Son of Man, he's going to come from God. He's going to blast those Romans. He's going to bring a new political empire for us. We're going to see a great new era is going to come. And Jesus, instead of coming to bring retribution, instead of to bring condemnation, he turns up and starts offering restoration and forgiveness. Even worse, restoration and forgiveness of people who didn't deserve it. This is the shock of what Jesus did. This is the way in and the way on. That yes, Jesus has come into our world, but often not like the way we think he is, to condemn that people, but actually he's come with this beautiful restoration, forgiving agenda. Look at the impact it has on this man, Zacchaeus. We read a little bit about him in verse 2. There was a man named Zacchaeus, chief tax collector, and he had become very rich. I get a sense that Zacchaeus started off quite well. It's actually a Greek name, Greek Jewish name, and it means pure, chaste, warm, and charming. This is a description of this man. Somebody who's warm and charming. You think, wow, his parents must have looked at him a little bit. Oh, so cute, so warm, so charming. Started off so well. Yet something clearly went wrong in his life. He's there in this border town of Jericho, surrounded by tax collectors. And of course, tax collectors in those days are different to our day. Well, I think they were. But back then, you know, it's the equivalent of mafia. It's the equivalent of extortion. You know, our equivalent, I suppose, would be someone who's running county line drug deals here. This is this type of guy. And even worse than that, even worse than just extorting money off people, sending his gang of thugs around to get their money off them, he is then a collaborator with the Romans. I was trying to think what picture could give you this. To me, it would be like the situation in Ukraine, where the Russians have invaded a certain city, and a Ukrainian puts up his hand and said, I'm going to help you Russians get tax off our people so you can maintain your new empire in our country. Can you imagine the impact of that, the hatred, the resentment towards this guy? This is a guy who Jesus steps in with and starts to make a difference there. And look at the difference there. We read in verse 8, meanwhile, Zacchaeus stood before the Lord and said, I'll give half my wealth to the poor. Lord, if I've cheated people on their taxes, I'll give them back 4 times as much. Do you see the transformation? The money grabber, the guy who lived for money, has suddenly become giveaway. He no longer owns his own money. He has suddenly become a steward of it. This stuff ain't mine. It belongs to God. As a result of the encounter with Jesus, it was this complete transformation in this man. Very much using some big language that would be very typical of the day in the Middle East. Basically, the guy is bankrupting himself. Clearly he's cheated people. Clearly he's done people out their taxes. And he's saying, I'll pay back 4 times as much. Wow, what a transformation. What a difference. Trusting God utterly and completely. Just gives ownership of everything he has to God. And says, yeah, God, I'm so taken over by your forgiveness, by you being interested in me. I'm giving it all back to you. Incredible, drastic response of this man. But this is the difference Jesus made. Well, you can imagine the people were absolutely thrilled about this. As we shall see, they are definitely not. Forgiveness and the war that goes on with the crowd. In verse 3, we see Zacchaeus at the beginning before he met Jesus. Zacchaeus tried to get a look at Jesus, but he was too short to see over the crowd. There was something about this man. Even though he was a horrible, nasty person on the outside, there was something going on the inside that meant he was absolutely desperate to see Jesus. But we see a couple of barriers here. First of all, there is a crowd. Tax collectors, traitors, collaborators, and crowds do not go well together. You can imagine him being in the crowd. That wouldn't go too well. Someone might find a very sharp implement and just bang into his back and say, yeah, let's get rid of that fella. And also, he had another problem. He was only a very little man. I have got no idea what that concept is. I'm sorry, it's probably been about 40 years till I can grasp this. I'm the type of guy you hate to stand behind in a crowd. You know, sometimes when I go to sports events or some music concerts where it's standing, there's always like 2 yards, 2 meters behind me that's completely empty. You know, I've stood at times at Wembley Stadium on the pitch at a concert, you know, and there's 80,000 people jumping up and down, and there's always a 2-meter space behind me because nobody can see anything, you know. This guy had a real problem. He couldn't see Jesus, even though he was desperate to go and meet him and connect with him and see something about him. But then, somehow, Jesus connected with him. And we read in verse 7, the people were displeased. Jesus had gone to be the guest of this notorious sinner, and they grumbled. Do you see the transition that's taking place here? The crowd was at war with Zacchaeus. They hated Zacchaeus because of his lifestyle. But then when you read in verse 7, who are the crowd against now? They're against Jesus. Do you notice that shift? Do you notice that swing there? Jesus sees this man, he sees the crowd getting angry at him, and Jesus intervenes and steps in and said, hey, if you're angry, channel it towards me. Jesus steps in and says, let your anger come towards me. Wow. Think about that. How powerful is that someone is prepared to step in and receive the anger of other people. The people were rightly displeased. Zacchaeus was a bad guy. They had expected Jesus to stay with one of their nice people in their town. Instead, Jesus picks the worst person in their town to go and stay with and be a guest of. And again, the whole idea, Phil and Rachel talked about hospitality. Back in these days, just going for a meal or staying with somebody was more than just a meal. It's this implication of you're accepted, you belong, we're friends. So mafia-like, horrible man with God, and God saying, we're mates. We belong together. This is radical stuff. Whole world, whole culture turned over. People saying, I thought you meant to be a rabbi. I thought you meant to be a man of God. You've got Passover coming up. You should behave yourself. You should be clean. What are you doing? So you can see the anger building, and Jesus takes that anger and places it on himself. He deflects it away from Zacchaeus, and he embraces it. Let's move on. Let's look at the tree, up and down. Here we go. Zacchaeus ran ahead and climbed the sycamore fig tree besides the road, for Jesus was going to pass that way. Why did Jesus reach out to this man? Well, I think from this verse we get a hint of how desperate Zacchaeus was. 2 things you do not do as a man in Jewish culture back then. 1, you don't run. Sorry, Ian, you would never fit into Jewish culture as a man who's always running. Not allowed in Jewish culture for men to run. It's undignified. It's not good. And secondly, you definitely don't climb. Because if you're any familiar with the dress sense in Jewish culture, men wore robes. So you can imagine climbing trees. If you looked up, there could be quite a nasty sight if someone in a robe is up above you. You know, indecent exposure. You know, they just didn't climb because it was inappropriate with their clothing. This guy was so desperate to see Jesus, he ran and he climbed. Even though it's a source of shame and embarrassment in that culture, this guy was desperate to see Jesus. And I think this is why Jesus stepped in there and intervened the way he did, because he saw beyond the labels and saw a man who was desperate. And so Jesus then gives him the invitation, and we see the response in verse 6. Zacchaeus quickly climbed down. This is a good speed. Here we go. Took Jesus to his house in great excitement and joy. Amazing to see that with Jesus there is no hiding place. Sycamore fig trees would have been a great place to hide. They have quite low-hanging branches, so a little guy could climb up. They also have very big leaves, so possibly he could hide there. But either way, Jesus could still see him. He couldn't hide away from Jesus. And I just love this contrast. The crowd are judging this man. And what's Jesus doing? He's bringing joy to this man. As a result of Jesus forgiving him, as a result of Jesus connecting with him, there is a sense of joy. Jesus doesn't see, nasty drug dealing, tax collecting collaborator. Jesus sees desperation and says, that's what I'm going to connect with. I don't care about your labels. I'm looking at your heart and I'm seeing something desperate, and that's where I'm going to go to work, even if I get the grief and the stick and the anger of the people. Oof, what a challenge when it comes to forgiveness, hey? As we look at people, what do we see? Do we see the labels? Yeah, you hurt me, you did this, you did that. Or do we see a heart of desperation like Jesus did? And now we've made it all the way, all this digging from the outside in to find the treasure, which is the wonderful love of Jesus. There's been a build-up to this verse, if you like. Verse 5 says, when Jesus came by, he looked up at Zacchaeus and called him by name. Zacchaeus, he said, quick, come down. I must be a guest in your home today. Just see the treasure that's here. Jesus looks and sees Zacchaeus. Jesus has got an agenda to get to Jerusalem. Jesus is on a plan to Jerusalem, but Jesus holds that plan to see somebody and make a difference in their life. He's prepared to divert his plan and his activity and make time for somebody that nobody else would do. And then secondly, he calls him by name. I can imagine the crowd as they spot Zacchaeus up the tree, they're calling him a few names, but I don't think any of them are Zacchaeus. They hate this man. They're abusive towards this man. And Jesus, as someone who stands up for what's righteous and what good, it'd be understandable. He would join with the crowd and say, yeah, that's a bad guy, let's get him. But instead, Jesus steps in there and intervenes and protects this man. He calls him by name. Do you remember what Zacchaeus' name was? Warm, charming, pure. Jesus doesn't look at him and say, hey, tax collector, hey, wicked, evil man. Doesn't do any of that. Calls him by name. Sees him, calls him by name. Oh, I love that. My name, me, David, means beloved. When Jesus looks at me, he doesn't see croissant stealer from the day before. He doesn't see Scouser, a little bit dodgy. No, he sees beloved. He sees us and calls us by name. This is what Jesus does. This is what Jesus is about. This is what the Christian faith is about. And then he finishes off, I must be a guest in your house. Jesus just longs to hang out with you and me. Do we get that? The King of creation, the Lord of lords, the guy who's made everything, the God of everything says, I want to be with you. I don't care what you've done. I don't care where you've come from. If there's any hint of desperation for me in your heart, come on, let's get together. Let's get together and be together. This is the treasure in this encounter. Goes against culture, goes against everything within those times. But this is the heart and ministry of Jesus that continues even today. Wow. Urgent business taking place here, isn't there? So to finish off, celebration response. There's great joy in the heart of Zacchaeus as he has this encounter with Jesus. What's our response today of this wonderful love of God? When you think about Jesus seeing you, how do you feel about that? He doesn't miss you in the crowd. He can see you. Jesus wants to call you by name. Jesus wants to give you a personal invitation. Are we open to that? And that invitation is to be with you, to hang out with you. And then, of course, he wants us to pass on the forgiveness to others. Zacchaeus responded to the invitation, and he didn't just leave it as a personal thing. He started to bless and impact other people. So we see this sort of facilitation of forgiveness. So today, what urgent business have you got with God when it comes to forgiveness? Remember for Zacchaeus, Jesus said, I must be a guest in your home next week, a few weeks' time. No, today. Today is a day to do business with God. Today is a day to receive that invitation from Jesus. Perhaps you've never ever said yes to Jesus, or perhaps you said yes to Jesus many years ago and you've been flying, but there still might be stuff within you where you just said, you know what? I still need to meet with Jesus. I still need to be cleaned up. I still need to be forgiven. And so before we turn to communion, we just want to pause and give a time just to reflect on that, and I'll hand back to Ian for a second. Thank you.